Aitken Workshop is an annual event, either in the winter or the summer or both. That is a long-standing tradition of AST to provide for students at some point during the academic year a workshop on preaching. And that is because the endowment that is managed by Pine Hill Divinity Hall, that was given in memory of Dr. Ed Aitken, who was president and professor at AST, because his great love was preaching. And in fact, his love of preaching was one of the reasons that AST's Theological Library has one of the best collections of homiletical literature anywhere in Canada. And I discovered this when I was doing my own doctoral work and thought that I could do some of my work in Toronto. Discovered I had better resources here. And both his own library, where if you're looking at a book on preaching that is that was written before his death in 1995, may have his name in it because his library was at school, or the library's continued policy of continuing to keep its homiletic section current. That's one of the marks of his love of preaching and teaching preaching. But the other is the gift to the school in his name that makes it possible for us to engage, whether it's lecturers or a panel as we're doing this year. The last time we had a panel was in 2013, and the experience of that panel was very positive. I still hear about it from people in the school community. And I arranged that panel and then went on sabbatical, so I wasn't here for it. And one of the things that I made sure we did was to engage several of our alumni and to make sure that the denominations that are in the majority here at AST are represented. This time I decided to do two things. One is to put it on a date when Kimber McNabb could be here, because that was my main purpose in 2013, and she couldn't make it. The other was to offer you a truly ecumenical panel. And so we have four different denominations represented here today. The topic is 4 things I learned about preaching after I left college, similar to the topic that was covered 2 years ago. And I've asked our speakers to share with us something about themselves, their background, their theological education, their education in preaching, where they preach now, or where they are engaged in ministry now, and then to share some insights on what they learned through experience. So I won't introduce them in detail. I'll give them the opportunity to share something of themselves. And I have Tim McFarland, who is the chaplain at Acadia University. And Tim's an old friend of mine from his days in ministry here in Halifax as associate at First Baptist Church. And Tim introduced himself to a friend today as my former spouse. We used to go to the gym together, and one of the men thought we were married. So,
because afterwards we talked about, well, let's go to groceries.
You know what men are like. You don't talk in the locker room. Really talk. We talked about really serious stuff. And then is Rob Jeffery, who some of you know. He graduated AST in 2014. He has been in ministry for a number of years with the Salvation Army. And then we have Kimber McNabb, who is pastor at Resurrection Lutheran Church here in Halifax, and is a wonderfully creative preacher and a very dedicated runner. So you may see her when the ice clears on the streets of the West End or around Metro. Sometimes. And then to my immediate right is Jeff Lackie. Jeff is a minister at Thorburn in Sutherland River in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, with the Presbyterian Church of Canada. Jeff. Yeah, that's me. Jeff was a parishioner of mine in Petrolia, Ontario, a few years back.
Extra March, if you know where that is.
Yes. Although some of you apparently didn't know where Pictou County, Nova Scotia is. So. And we think it's the center of the universe. We are recording this afternoon so that we can share our recording with our distant students. I'm going to go. I'm going to go in denominational alphabetical order. each of our guests will speak, and we'll have a few minutes where we'll invite them to share among themselves at the table, and then we will throw it open for questions. So I'm going to start with...
Why are there no Anglicans here?
I'm going to start with our Baptists.
It's not a question you usually hear from.
Hi everybody, I'm Tim, and I was born in Fredericton, New Brunswick. I, by birth and then by later on choice, grew up in a Baptist environment in a relatively center-conservative but pretty big church in downtown Fredericton called Brunswick Street Baptist Church, or Baptist Church. I took an undergraduate in history at St. Thomas University, so I got a lot of good education from Holy Cross College, that Roman Catholic University, and then moved to Wolfville, and where I got married, wondered what I was going to do next. Served as a chapel assistant at the chapel where I now work, so God's sense of humor is not lost upon me. And following that year, in discernment, then went to attend Acadia Divinity College, where for 3 years I took the courses necessary to graduate with the MDiv. I then served 4 Point Country Parish on the far end of the Annapolis Valley, in a place called, well, there is no one place called Lower Granville, but the region's called Lower Granville, but Victoria Beach, Port Wade, Carsdale, which was closed but sort of honored, Port Royal, and Granville Beach. So for a while there, I had 3 services a Sunday and had to come up with at least 2 sermons that sounded a little bit different. There wasn't that much crossover from one end to the other, but that was a bit of a discipline area. After 4 years serving there, I came to Halifax and worked at First Baptist Halifax for 11 years as the associate minister with a special focus on Christian education. But one of the things that I requested at the time of the call to the search committee was that a component of preaching not be lost in my life, because I think it was necessary to at least keep most of the rust off of that particular tool. So I was able to preach once a month on average at that church. And then associates often get called upon to fill in for other ministers who might go off on vacation. So I've had occasion to preach at St. Andrews, St. Matthew, St. David's, Bears Road Baptist, other Baptist churches in the area, and then called to Acadia University in 2007. This is a different discerning process. Try to get shortlisted and then hired. But got hired and went into a place where at that time there were 11 services during the week. The Vespers are not that highly attended, so I've reduced that and do other things. But we still have, as I think you do here at AST, is 5 chapel services throughout the week, Monday through Friday, and then I have a Sunday night service. I was telling Lawrence and others that I've become very good now, unlike most Baptists, to the 5 to 7 minute message, because my chapel services weekdays are 20 minutes in length, and you have to, and I find it actually more difficult to do that, to truncate a message to that. And then Sunday nights I often have guest speakers, so to expand out again was both a privilege and a bit of a challenge for me today as I joined you in worship. So that's a little bit about where I've been and where I've preached, thinking in terms of some of the lessons that I learned after seminary about preaching. My first sort of smart-ass answer was going to be, well, everything. But that isn't true. It's not true, because I did reflect back on my homiletics experiences, and it was a teamed environment there. There was a fellow who was a Southern Baptist, but this was before the huge purge of liberals and moderates, who was teaching at the Divinity College, and he had the big booming voice coming out of a relatively small body that could teach you about projection and all sorts of things. And then there was his partner was a much older man who was, although retired, still preaching in the course and addressed the disciplines. And so they did address some things. But some of the things that I learned after leaving, and I was thinking, gosh, we could probably, all of us, have very common ground in certain things. One of the common things that I'm thinking that all of us could say, so this doesn't count as one of the 4, and if it's one of your 4, too bad. Often the sermon that I will have preached that I thought was the most profound moment of proclamation, I will learn very swiftly flopped. and communicated absolutely nothing beyond 2.5 feet in front of the pulpit and was merely my own ego at play. And the sermon that I think was tough to do, not really communicated a whole lot. I wasn't feeling very excited about it before or after, and then I will hear from somebody, thank you so much for pointing this out to me. Thank you for helping me along or identifying something that I can resonate with you. And that teaches me the humility both of the preaching event. I see it very much as part and parcel, as a theological element in what we do is called ministers. It's humbling also when I see that what I might think of as dross is uplifted by God's Holy Spirit and transforms into something far beyond than Tim's ego and Tim's preparation time into something else. Number one. That was kind of like the prelude. Number one. Regardless of life and all that entails that, the preaching event comes around regularly, conveniently or inconveniently. Saturday is no longer known as Saturday, it's known as the day before Sunday. When I lived in Prospect, a 25 minutes drive out, and for the first 2 or 3 years of my life here working as an associate, I had a sermon to preach on a November morning. Saturday night before, I had kind of did it around, think, oh, I get to this, Anne's away, she's down in Wolfville visiting her parents, I'll plug away things, and I had read stuff throughout the week, and oh, but it's okay, but I got loads of time, it's just me and the dog, and power. Lines had crossed the street, and had blown up my refrigerator motor, most of the lights, all things electronic that had been plugged in went because there was a huge surge. I was thinking, oh, fancy that. Thank goodness Baptists have a tradition of extemporaneous preaching. But I had to, and managed to get through. Got into the church in the morning, was able to print what I had. This was the days before flash drives, but I was able to cobble something together. But it always reminds me of the inconvenient times. More seriously, the inconvenient times. Stress going on within your family. Stress going on inside here. Something of which you were aware in the congregation. Those tough times are going to accompany you, as do the easy times it is when you prepare. But you are called, yes, to a vocation. You're also called to a responsibility and a job. It doesn't mean that you have to be in control and superhuman all the time. But it does mean that you are given the role of facilitating in worship. That type of responsibility that you're going to address in the proclamation, and just be prepared for when it's really tough. And I will finally say on that point number one, that's sometimes one of the best sermons emerge. I don't remember that one in November if it was the best one. Number two, Simon and Garfunkel principle. So I am a Christian, and I follow the path of my Christian expression because I'm in wonder and gratitude of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. That is setting the example for me and for you. A person who will come and do what we in the Maritimes do is the cross-referencing. Oh, you're from Pictou. Well, do you know? Oh, really? You're from Guelph. How about we try to find these lines of intersection in which we have, oh, nuts. Oh, I know you. I can understand. I get what you're saying. I'm there with you. Simon and Garfunkel principle, they wrote a lot of songs, and they included time and time again. Go back if you've ever listened to them or find out about them for the very first time if you haven't. They use common items and imagery to get their listeners to go, apple pie, magazines, smoking a cigarette on a bus back in the days when that was allowed. All sorts of familiar imagery, and very early on, that's what I call the principle of finding those contact connecting points with the congregation you're serving. Yes, to be sure, working in commentary and working with abstract thought and some of the many interpretations of one scripture or the other, those are very much important. But if you stay there, you and I both know that we're going to at least lose out on some sort of connecting point. In your congregation, as in the classroom, there are represented, on average, 5 different types of learning styles. That means you've got it pretty much made with one of those types, because you're connecting. But you've got the challenge to find connecting points, familiar things, be they in illustrations or something else, connecting challenges with everyone else so that they can hear you on some level what you're trying to communicate. Number 3, stop comparing yourselves to other preachers. When I began preaching, and I would hear a lot of other ministers preaching at ecumenical events or events with gathered denomination representatives, I'd hear one preacher, oh wow, she totally gets it. I could never grasp onto that. Oh my gosh, he has timing down to an expertise. Over and over and over, I would plague myself with listening to others and yearning to be like that person or that person. And finally resting in what God's given to me and shown me that I can incorporate this strength, that skill, this interest, that experience into what can become mine. And no, I'm never going to be like that person or the other person down at another church, and that's a good thing. Because if we were all homogenous in that way, well, the preaching event would not have the kind of zest and energy I think that it should have when it comes to proclamation. Number 4, I call this the breathe, step, shrug method of life. So whenever I'm going into a situation, whether it's here at this chapel, where the last time was, I think, about 20 years ago, I performed a wedding ceremony when everything was up there and it looked that way. So it's been a while, right? You breathe before you go into any situation, and that's breath with spirit, right? Ruach. That's calling into being that place. Just take that, find that time, breathe, step into it confidently. There might be unexpected things, such as people collapsing in your congregation in the midst of a sermon, and I don't think they're always slain by the Spirit. It's a health problem, or something else. Those unexpected things that might occur. Breathe, step, and when the stuff happens that you're just not happy with, that you haven't been satisfied by, that you're frustrated by, maybe somebody's given you a comment that has kind of been a smack upside your egotistical head, or whatever, learn how to shrug. Not everything is to get upset about or to go all drama. Breathe, step, shrug. I try to do that every time I get out of my car in the parking lot at Acadia, every morning, and it helps me a little bit each day to face whatever unexpected things might come my way. Lastly, important aspects of preaching. I would say that number 1, if you have not already done so, find a way in which you can incorporate this wonderful tool and instrument you have been given. Navi, a prophet, like a mouthpiece into the trumpet. You're the mouthpiece into that proclamation of God's word. Take care of the instrument. We've taken for granted this day and age too many microphones and speakers and all sorts of automated things that we think can do the job for us. No, this is the tool to take care of. So drink lots of water. Learn how to project. Not shout, project. And learn how to communicate. One of my big problems is that I start going too rapidly, and so I don't allow people time to process. Because I have so many important thoughts that you really want to know, and I have to share them all with you right now, okay? And I have to stop and learn the timing and learn to move in the rhythm with the pattern of the congregation. And that means being mindful of seniors and kids and everybody in between. So that type of preparation, taking care of the tool. You don't preach to answer all of those universal questions, in my opinion. I think we preach to question all of those things that come up, not to achieve a confidence and certainty that has us leaving through the doors at the end of the day thinking, oh, we now have a monopoly on all truth. But instead saying, no, we're pilgrims in this search. We are joining one with another to identify the questions and to wrestle with them. And if you can spark that type of hunger within your congregation, in my opinion, you are doing what I think preaching should be able to do. And I'm finished. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. That was well said, I think, but appreciate it all.
It's a holy number,
Appreciate it all of those points, and I do want to sight of whoever it is that is collapsing. You don't have to run down from the pulpit and say the world. Yes. So, Kimber, your hands.
As you've heard, I'm a Lutheran pastor, the only actual Lutheran pastor in all of HRM at this time that is serving a congregation. I've been a pastor for 17 years. My first 6 years were spent in a rural congregation in northern New Brunswick. We had one church that was Happy Danes and one church that was Dour Danes. Both got the same sermon on a Sunday morning. One church they might giggle at the other. I have lived in Halifax for 11 years. I serve a congregation that is probably one of the most diverse Lutheran congregations I have been a part of. Generally, Lutheran congregations are one predominant ethnicity that was the founding population. So my tradition is a German tradition. The parish where I serve was formed by a group of Germans that came up from Lunenburg County, Norwegians who came during the First World War. During the Second World War, people from Eastern Europe, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Hungary, many displaced persons became part of the congregation. With the military here, lots of Danes, Finns from across the country, and with the universities, many doctoral and master students who come in and out. So our congregation is a very eclectic group, although we all look white. We all look the same. We're totally not. The first sermon I delivered was in my home parish when I was 16 years old. It was a youth service, and the boys, because I was the only girl that liked to talk, was asked to do the sermon. I remember writing it out in pen, printed neatly on cards that were about this wide, this long, box board from my favorite kind of cereal. I had it all color coordinated as to where I would pause, where I would smile, where I would, it was all there. Everything I said numbered in the corners of my first sermon. Since then, I have varied away from using cardboard to write my sermons on, but now I will wear wigs, flannel pajamas, use glitter dust, throw confetti, put salt down the aisle of the church. I will sing phrases, all kinds of wonderful things that Lawrence might have alluded to as being a creative preacher. You might want to ask me questions about that later on. I didn't write any of that into said talk. When I was on internship, I was in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which is the farthest end of our synod. It was a group of Finns and a group of Germans. I preached every other week, and I had a great supervisor who he allowed me to play a little bit, and he pushed me, and I learned an awful lot from him about preaching. I also did gigs in KW when I was in seminary, rural and urban parishes. My MDiv is from Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, connected with Wilfrid Laurier University, and since then I've completed a doctoral degree at Acadia Divinity College. 4 things that I've learned about preaching. In seminary, it was made quite clear that pastors, particularly those that preach, need to speak as Reinhold Niebuhr said, with a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. Although after coming out of seminary, I found that the words are also attributed to Karl Barth. Anyway, I knew that to be was to be attuned to what the gospel was saying and what the world was saying. That the Bible and the newspaper were to go hand in hand. Both were necessities. What I didn't know was how much more reading was required. To be a good speaker of any kind, one needs to take in 10 times the amount you output. 10 times. I don't remember where I heard that or read that, but it has had a dramatic effect on my preaching ability. I incorporate into my sermons my wrestling with texts, use illustrations from movies or plays, and I reflect on the novels from a theological perspective. There's something else, though. The more reading that I do, that is theological books, magazines, newspapers, historical fiction, and yes, a good share of trashy or even steamy or smutty novels, the less time I will spend staring at a blank screen their expressions, their phrases, their articulation of ideas and thoughts, their choice of movement from the beginning to the end, all contribute to the patterns and the ways that the electricity runs through your brain. It actually will affect how it is that you write and put words together. It facilitates the use of your own imagination and the way that you can retell the gospel in today's world. A diversity of reading allows the reader a wealth of styles from which to recreate the text and vision for preaching. Number 2. I had the pleasure of having Edward Rieger as my homiletics professor. One of his books is actually here at the AST library and probably was put there by some of the money from Mr. Aikens. It's entitled Imaginative Shock, Preaching, and Metaphor. Although fairly tiny in structure, Ed could captivate an audience. I heard many professors and now colleagues say that they could have listened to Ed preach all day long. And that was always my impression too, the way he could weave a story. The reason for this, I believe, was the way in which he would use his voice. Words were specifically chosen and said with thought and feeling, every one of them. It was also his tone and his cadence. Ed, although if you hadn't had him as a professor, you would never know, had a significant hair lip growing up. He had spent an awful lot of time in speech therapy, learning to talk, to pronounce. Through his life, he had to think about every word that he said before it was spoken, so that it would come out correctly. Needless to say, homiletics class was filled with a component of practicing speech exercises. How many of you have practiced speech exercises? Yes. And painful at times. However, this many years later, I have learned that no amount of speech therapy will help with some tics or some stutters. When I write words, there are specific words that I avoid because I have difficulty saying them. I think some of it comes from once upon a time perhaps stumbling over said word, and now I get nervous and it just won't come out. Or perhaps my tongue just never did work right in the first place. Every time Matthew 24:38 comes up in the Revised Common Lectionary, I start to sweat. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. Can you guess which word I usually avoid in sermons? Take a guess. Marrying. Which also means that I leave out carrying, burying, and similar such words. And I honestly have trouble with words that end in D with an ED added afterwards because they make me stutter. Forwarded it, rewarded it. You get the picture, and I didn't even try to do that.
No, I'm saying
I didn't need an extra word on my list for myself. But instead of kicking myself and being embarrassed or extra nervous, I just humbly accept that there are certain words and constructs that I would rather not use. Number 3. I have a colleague, actually a seminary professor's wife, who is a Lutheran pastor. She is not 5 feet in height. In Lutheran circles, preaching can take place in various places throughout a sanctuary, but more often than not in the Canadian context, you will find yourself in a pulpit at some point. Many of our churches were built before 1974 when women became pastors. Pulpits were made for tall men. My less than 5 foot tall colleague carries with her an old-fashioned Coca-Cola box. They were wood and they were sturdy. She takes it with her to every preaching gig. She places it in the pulpit before the service. That way, when she gets up to preach, she can see over the lectern, but also above the often fixed podium light, which would make her look like a disembodied voice. Now, I am fairly tall, and I can make most pulpits work, but I have learned that to be comfortable, confident, and to make it appear that I am hardly reading, if reading my script at all, that I need to adjust the podium height. Believe it or not, most of those old pulpit podiums move about 4 or 5 inches. Sometimes it takes a little banging to get them to move. Don't be shy. As I said, I come from a German tradition where people can be somewhat stodgy about touching furniture. But show up early. Set your script, bang the pulpit, no one will think you're wrecking your furniture. Now, in my experience, it is better to have a pulpit that is too low than too high. If it's too high and in one's face, you always look like you're reading from something, even if you're not. The farther away your notes, the more conversational your sermon will be. And always be ready for surprise. Once I arrived to preach in a place where the pulpit was ridiculously low, and that was before I was 40. I fixed that by slipping off my high-heeled shoes, and everything was fine. Generally, I preach from the pulpit, sometimes from the aisle or the steps of the chancel. Since seminary, I've learned that pulpits have added benefits, more than people just not seeing your knees shaking, and more than being a symbol of the importance of the word. I have a number of parishioners who sit in the front 2 rows because they have problems with accents and they have problems with hearing. They sit in the front 2 rows so they can read my lips. When I'm in the pulpit, they are guaranteed to see almost every word that I say. Number 4. On the day of my ordination, I had a lifelong pastor who was very close to retirement tell me to never worry about an ill-prepared sermon, so long as it was ill-prepared because I was spending time loving my people. Now, he wasn't suggesting that that could be an excuse that I used very often. He was saying it because he knew how hard I would be on myself that first experience of running out of time and running out of energy. It was 4 months into my first call. I was called to a manor because a 64-year-old woman was dying after a long struggle with multiple sclerosis and a bout of breast cancer. Her family wanted me there to do vigil with them. Hers was the first death that I had witnessed, and the first funeral that I would preside over by myself. Less than a week after her death, and 4 days before Christmas Eve, I am called because parishioners were in a car accident, a husband and wife, both in their 70s, both died, and in the other car, an infant also died. As small communities go, lots of people were related. Lots of people grieved, lots of people needed pastoral care, and lots was given. 3 funerals, 7 days, one of them a double, with Christmas preparations in full swing. I was 25 years old. Prepared? Not really. Sunday came. The first Sunday I would not be prepared. The same day in the afternoon was the first funeral for which I did have a sermon. I decided that Sunday that I would read a story, someone else's story. It was called Some of My Best Friends Are Trees. I even decided to read it as a teacher would read her grade 2 class a storybook. The theme of it was hope in times of darkness, and it paired nicely with the reading from Isaiah about hope in the desert. What I found is that the words hit the spot, so to speak, for the people welcomed the style and the story, and not one complained or commented that I had failed to do my job as a preacher, because I loved my people first, and I followed my heart and did what I needed that day. What I continue to find, as Tim said earlier, that Word, with a capital W, will always surprise me. The Spirit has a way of taking whatever it is that I preach in between my mouth and the hearer's ears, the hearer's heart. It can change, speaking directly to the person whatever it is they need to hear. And I can't count the number of times that people have said, "Pastor, I appreciated when you said," when I know full well I said no such thing because I misheard. I've also found that the word, capital W, is heard despite the giver of the word. On my worst Sundays, the days I think and feel that the sermon has been absolutely dreadful, those days I receive some of the best feedback from people who never comment on a sermon. For this I am really grateful. It is a grace to know that the word, when proclaimed, acts in mystery and in marvelous ways. I also take comfort that should preaching fail within my tradition, standard Lutheran practice is that there is Eucharist every Sunday. So if I fail, the word can still be heard and experienced through the sacrament of Eucharist.
Thank you, Kimber. I just want to say that issues to do with the positioning of the reading service in the pulpit are not specific to gender or height. There is one area in which they're universal, and that is when you reach that point in your life when you have to have more than one way to see through your glasses. And it took me months after my first pair of multi-focus glasses to find the right position in the pulpit. And I moved that thing up and down and changed my position back and forth, and I even preached out of the pulpit before I found the proper place. So thank you for that very helpful hint. But I also want to echo your last point, Kimber. When we have those weeks when it seems like the ground is opened up and all kinds of stuff from underneath has come up at us, those are the times when, on the one hand, the regularity of the Sunday service and the call to preach is one of the anchors that we have. But on the other hand, when we realize that not only are we upheld by the Holy Spirit, but we are standing on the shoulders of the saints. So, let's get back. Jeff, you're your hands up.
I was working my way through the alphabet trying to figure out. Yes, yeah. We've tried in Victor County to make Rob and his father into Presbyterians unsuccessfully. They've served congregations for us in the past in vacancies. I was born and raised in southwestern Ontario, aka 5 hours from the center of the known universe, Toronto. As Lawrence mentioned, he was our family's minister and pastor and friend for about 9 years when he served the church of my growing up and the church of my eventual belonging. I have been elected an elder in the Presbyterian tradition. We have ruling elders and teaching elders. Lawrence was the teaching elder, and I became was at the time probably one of the youngest ruling elders that they had. Not altogether newly married, but fairly fresh on the ground. Out of high school, I unsuccessfully navigated an attempt at becoming a music teacher. I went to the University of Western Ontario for 2 years, succeeded only in meeting the love of my life, and then being asked not to return. It was not as hard for me to say okay to that as it was for my wife, but soon after that we were married, and the first question that came from an aunt of mine was, "Doesn't your wife sing?" "Yes." "Well, you should be in the choir." So I went back to church, but only after I was married, and one thing led to another. When Lawrence was in Petroleum, we had a very high vacancy rate in the presbytery, and I had been on the board of managers when we called Lawrence to Petroleum moving. There's 5 weeks vacation and educational allowance, and we're paying all the bills. If I thought I could work to deadlines and speak in public, I might do that. And of course, both of us laughed heartily, and instantly forgot it. To this day, I remain the only person that I know of that went into ministry for the money. Anyhow, I was nearly 20 years in the farm equipment business as a customer service person, parts department, service department, you name it. If you have a diesel engine, I can probably help you fix it, or tell you how to get it fixed, or tell you to buy something else. And along the way, as I say, there's a high vacancy rate, so Lawrence says to me one day, Presbyterian's putting together a workshop to teach lay people how to lead services, and because we need help, and you need to take that. Fine, thanks, okay, and I did, and I preached for him on a day off, and it didn't kill me, although it threatened to, and after that, the litany from Lawrence was, go back to school, go back to school, back to school, back to school. So I have, not only did I go into the ministry for the money, I have the world's only 20-year BA from the University of Western Ontario. And from there, I went to Knox College at the University of Toronto to study my MDiv. I commuted for that from near to Sutherland in Toronto. The Presbyterian put me in a student appointment, so I served a small congregation within the city of Sutherland in the village of Point Edward for 4 years while I went to school. So to recap, in the 7 or 8 years while I was doing my undergrad by correspondence, I was also doing bulk supply anywhere between 25 and 35 Sundays a year, and working 45 hours, 50 hours a week, and raising 2 small children with my wife. And the reason I knew I should continue is it didn't kill me. So I was called to Thorburn in the Sutherland River pastoral charge in 2006, immediately after my ordination. So we moved bag and baggage to Pictou County, and have been here ever since. Then comes the invitation to tell you about 4 things I learned about preaching since graduating Knox College. The first thing I learned about preaching, I learned before I got to Knox, and it's that I loved it. I didn't see that coming. I didn't. I don't speak in public, I don't work to deadlines, and here I was doing both, and I loved it. I came to Knox at a time of transitioning their preaching program, you could say. A long-standing professor of preaching was leaving for the West Coast, and we had a doctoral student offering classes when it was, because I was a commuting student, I had to work my schedule differently, so I couldn't study with Dr. Ferris, much to everybody's disappointment. I got to study with his doctoral student, which was great because she was in the mood to experiment, we try to do things, and if we failed, no problem. But I was also preaching regularly as in my student charge, so that was quite helpful. What I learned since then is that I learned not to despair over the infrequency of our preaching courses. In the Presbyterian Church, the Word is everything. Right? Sometimes the Word is too much. So I wanted more preaching in seminary, and I wasn't getting it. But I realized that everything else was connected to the preaching event. Every course I took, every lecture I heard, every paper I wrote, was designed to feed my preaching. So, number 1, all preaching is theology, and all theology is preaching. There's too much disdain occasionally for notion of a theological approach to a preaching event. And I'm not saying that you have to sail everything over everybody's head, but don't settle for the least common denominator. It's not worth it. You won't like it. You won't be challenged. You won't grow. Your congregation won't grow. Nobody is satisfied with drivel. It's not worth it. The style and substance of my preaching is formed by everything that I came to love about the history of the church, and even lessons, God save us, in polity. Everything. Process matters to preaching. The way we process things as a denomination or a congregation, which are quite often different, by the way, it all matters, and it all influences my preaching, certainly. The trust that you're dealing with people who are willing to learn stuff, even if that willingness only goes to the edge of their tightly held expectations. They might want to be engaged, but there is a line that they won't let you cross. They will think deeply with you and sometimes against you. Trust that. It'll be okay. Number two. Since leaving Knox, I realized that I crave, and this won't be a surprise to you, feedback. And at Knox, it was everywhere. In the hallways, in the dorm, in the cafeteria, because I was commuting, we carpooled back and forth. It was a 5, sometimes a 6-hour drive, depending on the weather. And so we got to unpack all of this stuff all the time. And I thought it was just natural. I thought that's what Christians do, right? Turns out no. Now, I didn't expect the same level of feedback, but I wanted something. And so I'll offer you this as a negative thing that I'm still working on. I'm not getting it. I have to look for colleagues or places like this. I was so excited about this day, this workshop. I took the week off. I'm on a study leave. Because I didn't want to miss it. I knew if I didn't book it, something would come up. And as a matter of fact, it did. A colleague is conducting a funeral for me soon at home. I need feedback. And you'll have to find creative ways to get it. Sometimes it happens in a Bible study. But my approach to Bible studies are altogether different than my approach to preaching. Bible study for me takes much less preparation, and so it's spontaneous and dynamic. Preaching is not always. And there's no, you have to really work to figure out if you're saying the right things, if you're hitting the right notes. Much of it is visual. Presbyterians are not famous for leaping to their feet and waving their arms in the air and shouting hallelujah, unless, of course, the building's on fire or the furnace blows up. More on that later. So yeah, feedback. Number three, for some reason, even at seminary, I imagined that the homily, meditation, sermon at a funeral or a wedding was somehow disconnected from actual preaching. And for the first little while, that's how I approached it. I conducted a fair few funerals as a student, and it was a different experience altogether than I find it is now, when it's almost more important to me to be well prepared and well engaged with a funeral meditation or wedding meditation than it is on a Sunday morning, because the emotional availability of your congregation is so much greater. Not that I'm saying you should manipulate that, and I've heard it done. You can be aware of it, and I think for me that's where some of my feedback comes from. So I really appreciate the privilege of being able to proclaim the gospel on either end of those at that emotional scale. And the congregation is more responsive than it has permission to be on Sunday morning. 3.5. The lectionary can be your friend. Not a popular statement these days, and perhaps not in your sainted presence, but
my greatest enemy.
It's that face. You better watch it.
I know the face. I've seen it. It can be your friend. Even though I've had now almost 3 full cycles as an ordained person and almost 3 more before my ordination, I'm still finding texts that I haven't read or haven't preached or haven't worked all of the good out of yet. You can't do that, right? The material won't let you exhaust it. So, yeah, I still use the lectionary. However, I have also on occasion, most recently last year at the request of one of my Sunday school teachers, created a lectionary of the stories that they thought the kids needed to know that aren't covered. So we went from creation through, and you know, it's a little more work, it's a different kind of discipline, it's a lot of fun. I got to do some things that I haven't done. But I'm back on the lectionary. Let's get used to it. And I mean, Tim said something about preaching to questions. I feel that's been a gift of mine because I started with some very good instruction, I have to say, but with no academic background. I was able to stand up for 10 years before I got to Knox and say, look, I don't have any answers for you. I've got lots of questions. Right? Let's go after the questions. And the only 2 things necessary for a life of faith and for the integrity of preaching are curiosity and imagination. All the rest is stuff and nonsense. So, yeah, questions are good. And prep time, it'll disappear. I thought I was going to, this is number 4 finally. I think it's 6 really. I thought I was always going to have time to sit down Monday, to absorb the text, to consider my context, to read through the paper, to do all of that stuff that Martin and all those guys said. And I don't. I've been in my church for 9 years. I've been an interim moderator for 7, which means I've got responsibility to help other congregations find a called minister. I sometimes don't get to the text until Wednesday. It just doesn't happen. I don't like it, but it makes you creative. It makes you think harder. It makes me a better manager of the time that I do have. And I'm not there yet. And that's a fact.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Your 6 points. and not overlapping with Dr. Harris' remarks, may I actually be a blessing?
Yes.
Yes. And I love Stephen to bits, but he and I just not. And last, but far from least, is Rob Jeffery.
Hear then the parable. The kingdom of God is like a preacher who doth toileth on his sermon from Monday to Saturday, who poureth much blood, sweat, and tears into the manuscript, who readeth many commentaries, who consulteth the latest books on homiletics, When he arrives at his pulpit, he preaches with much fire and conviction. He makes his points brilliantly and fluidly, and lo, he doth impress even himself. But the people, upon hearing the sermon, line up at the door after the service to say unto the preacher regarding his preaching efforts, "My, that organ solo was nice today." The word goes out nonetheless. And in those moments of trial and tribulation, in those times of discouragement, the words of the preacher get recalled in the heart of the listener, like seed scattered on good soil. And the blessing returns to the preacher 100-fold. I don't mind admitting that I am a very novice preacher compared to my colleagues here. Although I did preach my first sermon at the age of 13. And I hope that 20 years later, I know a little bit more about preaching than I did then. But I will admit that I like preaching, and even that I like good preaching. It's hard to admit that one likes preaching today, because preaching kind of has a bad reputation. When people say, "Don't preach at me," or "I don't need to hear another sermon from you," they're equating preaching with being judgmental. And our dear friend St. Francis didn't make it easy on us when he said, "Preach the gospel at all times, use words when necessary." So preaching gets a hard hearing in the 21st century, which is why I believe more than ever the church needs to be the source of good, healthy, life-affirming preaching. Preaching that encourages and uplifts, but also preaching that equips the modern-day disciple to pick up the cross and follow. I come from a Salvation Army faith tradition. I went to our seminary, which we call a training college, from 2007 to 2009. And I pastored my first church, Spryfield Community Church, from 2009 to 2012. During that time, and even before I was called into the ministry, I was a student here at AST. And last year, I was able to finish my MDiv. And right now, I work for the Salvation Army Center of Hope on Goddard Street. And my weekly preaching is done to our shelter clients. And it's a wonderful privilege to preach to people who live on the street or who live near the street level. And it's really changed the tenor of my preaching, but it's one of my most enjoyable parts of the week. But 4 things I learned about preaching after I graduated from Theological College. That sounds like a propositional sermon in itself, doesn't it? But I'm told that propositional sermons are no longer in vogue. So here are some insights that I learned with regards to postgraduate. One, I learned that preaching is a lifelong learning experience. I really believe that the best preachers are those who dedicate their lives to developing and honing their craft. And theology school is really the perfect nursery for baby preachers. And I don't mean that in a diminutive way. I mean that this is really the place where we can cut our teeth on the craft of preaching and the discipline of preaching. The preaching laboratory that I discovered here and through my days in my own seminary is the place where you can be messy, where you can try stuff out, where you can begin to find your own voice. When I trained to be a Salvation Army officer, every time that you were on to preach in your supervised field education site, you had to submit your sermon manuscript 9 days in advance to your field supervisor. And they would go over your manuscript with you to make sure it was as good as it could possibly be. And you know, for me, that was a hard practice to submit to. To take a sermon that you created and watch it get torn apart, and your manuscript returned to you just with red ink all over it. I mean, it shows how our ego can get wrapped up in our sermons. And I ask the questions, who are you to critique my thoughts? But as time goes on, when you submit to a process like that, you find that your sermons actually begin to improve. Your writing improves, your thoughts become clear. Constructs that were kind of maybe hidden in the messiness of your manuscript come to the front. Your doctrine, your theology becomes more sound. And when we complete our formal education as theology students, we begin to see our full potential as preachers. Like Paul looking through a glass half darkly, we begin to catch a glimpse of who we are going to be as a preacher. When we receive our first appointment to a parish, a diocese, a church, the training wheels come off, so to speak, and my friends here have alluded to that. No one demands that we submit our sermon to be reviewed, and as is often the case, no one even offers constructive feedback. In fact, more people are likely to tell you that your sermon and your preaching is wonderful, even if that's not always the case. So I would say, if that's the reality, how important it is then under those circumstances to place yourself as a preacher under some of that discipline that you learned here, so that you can give your congregation the very best that you have within you. How do we do this? We read good books on preaching. We become skilled in various preaching methods. We take in sermon seminars and extended learning opportunities that our denomination offers us. So whether preaching for you will be like a 7-minute homily or a 20-minute sermon, remember that good preaching is an exercise in lifelong learning. My second point, I learned that the hardest thing about preaching is bringing it from the page to the pulpit. It takes a lot of skill to transform a sermon manuscript into an actual sermon. Consider that the backbone of most liberal arts education, which we're all a product of, is the time-honored essay. Right? Essays are essays. Sermons are not essays. The standard university lecture style, like the essay, resembles the sermon in some way, but a lecture is not a sermon. So what is a sermon? And I came up with my own definition of a sermon. I believe a sermon is a spoken form of communication that forms the faith life of both the preacher and the listener. It is typically grounded in the narrative of Scripture, and in our Christian tradition, it is a means of proclaiming the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Rudolf Bultmann spoke of the kerygma as the seminal event in which the believer participates in the life of God, life of Christ. And he says the relation between the saving act of God in us and the historical cross of Christ is that of part to whole, a first act to an entire drama, which continues each time that a person hearing the sermon makes the decision to be crucified with Christ. So to me, that's what a sermon does. But what a sermon is primarily is a spoken medium. To bring it from the page to the pulpit takes a lot of work and effort. But the reward is so satisfying when we can communicate a beautifully layered message that is both has many teaching moments in it, but is also easy to grasp. A message that not hammers down on people, but animates people towards change. In my Salvation Army faith tradition, we believe that all preaching should lead to a response in the life of the listener. And I don't preach every Sunday anymore, but when I do preach, I must work extra hard to remember that a sermon is primarily a spoken medium, and to work hard at getting it from my page to the pulpit. Thirdly, I learned that good preaching is not about you. And then I scratched it out and I said, okay, it kind of is. In my faith tradition, I heard officers, when they get up before they preach, they say a prayer. And they say words to the effect of, "Speak through me, God. May these words be not mine, but yours." And I mean, that sounds good. There's nothing overtly wrong with that. But the more I reflected on that, the more I realized there was a nuance there that I didn't quite agree with. I took exception to the idea that the preacher is little more than a divine conduit, a person stripped of their identity, their passions, their determination, their experience, and who, like some medium, just channels the divine in a way that annihilates the identity of the preacher. And I felt like that because that was never my experience when I was up in the pulpit. As a preacher, I was only all too keenly aware of my faults, my rough patches, my frailties. I did not feel like a conduit or a perfect conduit of proclamation for God's word, and that's okay. Because I believe that good preachers are good when they acknowledge their weaknesses and acknowledge their shortcomings, which is why I believe the spiritual life of a preacher is very important. God wants us to be ourselves when we're in the pulpit. It is true that whatever is going on in our life, good or bad, it shouldn't get in the way of our proclamation. But at the same time, the pulpit should never hide or obscure the person our Creator created us to be. I greatly enjoy listening to other preachers, learning from other preachers, maybe even emulating some of the better techniques of proficient preachers. But I'm best serving the members of my congregation when I'm being the preacher that I was meant to be, not when I'm trying to be someone else or when I'm hiding my true self from the congregation. Be yourself in the pulpit, find your voice, and your preaching will shine. And the final thing I learned about preaching since graduating from AST, and again, it kind of reflects to my experience as someone who was ordained but is now primarily fulfilling a layperson's role, is that preaching is too important to remain solely in the hands of the clergy. And again, more and more of our traditions represented here recognize the absolute value of lay people in ministry. You know, we know that lay people serve as readers, as teachers, as committee members, as musicians, as altar servers. But I also believe they can preach. I believe it's also incumbent on the clergy to help those in their congregation who are called to preach to develop these skills. Now, certain traditions may not allow for Sunday preaching to be done by a layperson, but there are many more opportunities to preach other than a Sunday morning. All of our traditions, I believe, have some flexibility in this, and I believe that we should encourage our people to take up the practice of preaching. One of my colleagues in Toronto, she ran a Salvation Army church in Regent Park, which is a very multicultural but kind of socially isolated part of that great city. And she was a wonderful preacher, but she would only preach maybe once a month. And she would offer the chance to preach of anyone in the church who wanted to. Now, it wasn't just a free-for-all where people got up and said like a Rick Mercer-style rant. She made them submit to the discipline of meeting with her, with meeting as a group, with learning something of the craft of preaching. And after they preached on their assigned Sunday with their assigned scriptural text, she would meet with them and as a group, and they would critique it. And I believe that's a wonderful way that we can help develop the gifts of preaching among our lay people. So I give that little plug to you who are going into ordained ministry to remember your lay people and remember that the gift of preaching, they deserve to practice in that too. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. And what I really want to know is, does your place in Nyack have a guest room? Rob is about to take up a new position with the Salvation Army in the United States, living and working near New York City. So, very good job. Your last comment, Rob, reminded me of a fellow I knew when I was living in residence when I was in seminary. He was a dental student, and he was a Brethren background, which was foreign to most of the mainline church students. And one of the things he said is, when we are 18, we all have to preach. The man, not the women, but we all have to preach. And everyone looked at him as we were sitting there. I think, playing poker. I think that's what we were doing. Which he learned at Bible camp. And somebody said, Ted, how do you handle that? And he just smiled and said, most of us just make sure we do it really, really badly, and we won't ever be asked to do it. But that's actually the exception to the rule, and I really resonate with what you said, Rob, and not just in the pastor's interest in finding people who might be possible candidates for ministry to ask to preach, but also in nurturing members of your congregation who do have something to share, something in their testimony, something in their experience, something in the insight that they have into Scripture, to encourage people just to practice forming their thoughts in a way that will then allow them to continue to tell their stories and continue to reflect as they do from their lives and experiences on Scripture and on the tradition. Thank you all very much. I could go on listening to all of you for the rest of the afternoon. What I'd like to do now for a few moments, well, first of all, what I'd like to do is take a couple moments. We can all stretch our legs. There are a few beverages and little food available in the classrooms. Let's take 5 minutes and then come back. Just a few minutes to invite any of the panelists to share anything more they have, particularly in relation to what they've heard others say or questions they'd like to ask one another. We'll have just a chance for a few minutes of interaction, and then we'll throw it open to your questions.
I need to know how much, how deeply the Baptists and the Lutherans and the Salvationists delve into the practice of other things besides liturgy. We're the liturgical college, right? Knox is the liturgical college, so which means I got 1 hour or 2 hour lecture on weddings, and the other hour was on funerals. Does that square with your collective? Was it all on-the-job training, or were you more widely grounded than I?
We had, although I didn't personally take the course, they did have homiletics courses specifically for preaching for special occasions. At the seminary, we did have a part of the semester on that in our regular preaching course in Homiletics 101 kind of thing. But then you could take an additional course for those special preaching occasions, which went far beyond weddings and funerals.
I'd say I had a similar experience to Kimber. It was part of a homiletics course, but also, yeah, through our field education, it was perhaps not a wedding, but something we were able, funerals, something we were able to take part in.
One of my assignments was to come up with a 52 or 48 week preaching series. And then when I graduated, I found out that there was something called a lectionary. The tradition for Baptists, by and large, don't come from the tradition where we really have a full grasp of the entire church calendar or Christian calendar. And so lectionary practice, by and large, is not done. I came from a tradition where people might do a 6-week series on the Lord's Prayer or a book of the Bible, etc. And that's all good. And I love some of the Baptist polity of the freedom that if on a given Sunday or something like that, if there's a particular issue that's happened nearby, etc., that I have, and I think maybe all of us do, the freedom to move away from the lectionary and to draw from something that is going to become more relevant. The strength of the lectionary practice, whether it's New Common Lectionary or something else, for me, is that if I adopt that discipline, I avoid the danger of preaching the same sermon every 6 weeks. Everyone in this room has probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 different topics which we're very, very passionate and we've gravitated towards in our understanding of theology, etc., etc. And we will preach, I guarantee, that same sermon, packaged a little bit differently with maybe a couple of illustrations that vary every 5 or 6 weeks, unless we have a discipline that causes us to preach from Psalm 137 someday, or the Abraham, Isaac up the mountain with a knife in hand sermon, or something that really stretches us to do, we've never been comfortable going there into those places, or some of the ones that maybe we just don't know a whole lot about. I'm not even let's get uncomfortable at the pulpit, but something that you need to learn and to develop. So for me, beyond seminary, from my tradition, that was an essential help and growing edge to have in my practice.
My guess is, though, that even every 6 weeks, your 3 things come up no matter what, if you're using one or the other.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I've been terrified to go back, and yet I want to do it as a discipline someday, go back through sermons and see what topics pop up most often. I'm pretty sure I know what they are. Nobody's called me on it yet. I just like to have some way to rebut and say, but grace is really important. I had a classmate that said, this is the easiest hard job in the world. You have to find 52 different ways to say, Jesus loves you. Take
a question, do you go back and ever re-preach a sermon? Because if you're preaching lectionary, you could go back and every 3 years.
When I was offering pulpit supply, some wise woman said, every sermon should be worth $1,000, which at the rate of the day was 10 times. $100 for a Sunday supply, right? And that both appalled and delighted me. And I can't do it. I can't. I have to be right against the wall to take something old and try and make it new. Because for me, at least, the big attraction is attacking it and finding fresh, trying to give it a fresh voice. So I will write until midnight Saturday rather than pull something out of the drawer and say, oh, I've done this before. The days that I really want to do something I've already preached, that's when I discovered that I was away. Every Sunday that gospel came up, I was on vacation. And I've never preached it. So you got it.
Do you guys re-preach sermons?
Rarely, but I did when I was in Lower Granville with the 3 Sunday services. When I first started, the first 6 months, I was writing 3 different sermons for Sunday. I said, maybe I can be using my time a little bit more wisely. Maybe there's another person that I can visit or another thing that I can be doing. So in that way. But that's where I take the illustrations, or having the newspaper on the other hand, the current events. If I'm going to preach the same sermon again, it'll be looking through it and changing, I think, important elements. But
yeah, sometimes that's as much work as writing something. If your references are dated to specific events or to a certain congregation, I've got 2 services every Sunday, and I do a little mental editing in the 5-minute drive between the 2 places. So it's the same text, but it's not always the same sermon. But sometimes to go back to something that's 6 or 9 years old and say, yeah, I'm going to do this. Oh, wait, no, that's not true anymore. And they'll never understand that. Before you know it, before I know it, I've written it again. Anyhow. So.
When I was growing up, we had a pastor, and he was a fairly good preacher. He could keep, occasionally, some of us who were 15, 16, 17 actually with him for at least 10 of his 20 minutes of talking. But the reason he did that is he used images. And he had one image that was actually a personal story of his in the Adirondack Mountains, which was his fall-to story. And I heard him preach it many times, over many sermons. And that got annoying, right? Like, it was a great image, but he overused it. So I try, if I use an image that has come out of a book or one that I know I've used, I'll make a note of it. Like, I kind of have a list of, oh, okay, this image is probably higher this. I've used this here.
Did you raise it to the rafters in the sanctuary like they do with hockey sweaters?
I found when you're with a congregation for two full cycles of the lectionary, there is still the risk that someone will remember, particularly a story you used 1 or 2 cycles ago, and But what I used to do occasionally was go back to remind myself what I did so that I wouldn't do it again. But sometimes under pressure, I would reuse some of the points that I'd taken from my exegetical work as a time saver. Oh yeah, the last time I dealt with this text, I had the time to go into the Greek or whatever. Oh yeah, I can do this. But you read it and you think, well, first of all you think, this guy's good after all. And then you realize, but I can't do it again. But fate had a way of biting me, because in my last pastoral charge, I had an office theft of my computer and 2 complete crashes. So I lost a lot of my old sermons because I didn't keep the scripts more than a couple of years. So that was a corrective. The difference is, and this relates to the question of the funeral preaching. I remember a friend of mine who's in a rural, small town pastoral charge, in fact is still there now over 20 years. But after she'd been there 5 or 6 years, she introduced some new stories to the stock that she called on for funeral sermons. And one of the reasons being that in a little village, chances are every funeral you're going to be looking at the same people. People would actually come up to her and say, that story worked so well at so-and-so's funeral, and I think it would have worked well here. Why didn't you tell it? And that gave her permission, particularly in that pastoral context, and as being with people, that they actually listened for some of the stories. But that again is going back to what's been said about the difference between the context of preaching on those occasions and preaching on Sundays.
Speaking in terms of having folks giving feedback, we talked about feedback a little bit. I can only endorse very, very strongly that if you have within the congregations or your listening gathering an individual with whom you have a great deal of trust, it could be a partner, spouse, it could be a very best friend, etc., who can give you some really good, honest feedbacks on even some of the technical logistics. For example, when I sweat, I perspire a great deal. And often if I'm wearing my Jedi Knight robes, chapel and things like that, it's pouring off my face. And if I don't have a hank or something, I'll do that, just wipe. And my wife will tell me, it looks like you're picking your nose every 20, 30 seconds. I have a habit of doing false landings, that is, 2 or 3 endings to the sermon, and my wife will do this. Is there a circle in the airport? She's like, oh no. I can see it. She will tell me about words that maybe I've repeated because all of us has a set of vocabulary habits that we're going to use, or sentence structures, things like that. Find that person, that individual that can give you those feedback items, and that makes it, in a pragmatic sense, a better communication event when you're doing. Finally, I'll shut up. Kimber mentioned text. I'm still, and this is right from seminary days, I'm still very much linked to writing things out longhand, and I do have that habit of, as you will have seen this morning, I will read heavily from my sermonic text, and different people have different opinions on what their comfort level is with that. I think that's perfectly fine. I think that we can do that. Something that I incorporated, though, to help me was when an illustration comes up, I never wrote my illustration out by hand. I would learn it if I wasn't that familiar with it, or if it was a story that I had, I would know it well, I would speak it out loud, and I just had an asterisk by that. And that forces me, if I'm becoming too linked and I'm losing any type of communicative touch with the congregation, that's just a device, a trick, a tool for me to lift up and to engage. So find those things that work for you as far as connecting and engaging.
I find I will have weeks when I will do an extemporaneous sermon on purpose for that reason. I do more preparation work for an extemporaneous sermon than I do for one that's written. And I will go for, I'm a long distance runner, and I will go for a very long run. And I will run through the sermon at least 4 times, beginning to end, without pauses, stops, or ums. And then I know I have it. Then I will sleep. And before that, it won't happen.
the text thing is interesting because when I started supply preaching, it was a typewriter, and I would always make my worst mistakes at the bottom of the type page and either have to start again or buy the way to franchise. So when I got my first computer, I was delighted because now I can do all my editing and correcting on screen. Man, this is great, this is fabulous. But I had to play with how the words get laid out on the page to help me with my phrasing and pace and things like that. So, and I experimented with all kinds of stuff. I went through a time, I'm ashamed to say, that it was all point forms. I'm going to be a point form preacher. Well, the points got to be paragraphs because I just couldn't think of where to stop in my writing. So, well, that's too hard to read. So I laid out like poetry, right? Big indents and shift it all over the page because it forces me it gives me visual clues. And where I need to pause, what I need to emphasize. Now I'm back to paragraphs again. I don't know what that means. Primarily, it's easier to put it up on the website because for all kinds of reasons we can talk about till midnight if you want. I post them every week when I have a text. It forces me to get a text. And to put it up online, it needs to be in a straight format. So, but it does make a difference if you're having trouble pacing or phrasing. Write it out the way you want to say it. It works. Visual clues help us, and it helps you give the congregation a visual clue. This is not a false landing. I really am going to stop. My wife is no good at the signals, and she works occasional Sundays, so I can't count on her.
Your wife people.
Yeah, doesn't she? And she doesn't appreciate being a text editor either. I discovered early on. I would get all excited and I'd hand it to her and say, "What do you think?" "Yeah, that's pretty good." And then I'd preach it and she'd say, "That's not what you wrote." "Don't do that to me again." She says, "I was waiting for something else and you gave us something different. Don't do that to me." So lately, a colleague and I have initiated kind of an ad hoc occasional pulpit, or not pulpit exchange, we've done that too, but a sermon exchange. If she's wrestling with something she's not sure of, she'll send it to me. And okay, and I'll send it back. And so we have a little bit of that kind of feedback that I've discovered I really missed from seminary for sure.
I started to move away from having a full text. Well, back when I was in petroleum with a 2-point charge, but what I found was with 2 services on Sunday morning, I could preach off my text once, and it was so exhausting. It took so much more energy. That if I did it in the first sermon, I would stay with my manuscript in the second. If I stayed with the manuscript in the first sermon, in the second service, I'd leave the manuscript on the floor and down on the floor and walk around with it, and I could do that, but I couldn't do it twice. But that drive between the 2 churches was often a related to the sermon. I could not say precisely to the 8 people at the little church in the country that I could say to the 8 in town. And it took me 18 minutes to get there, so I warmed up for the sermon, and it always took me 12 minutes to get back. So I had a very quick revision of the sermon on that drive back.
That's something else that nobody really touched on directly. But coming from a different background, working in a shop or in an office, nobody prepared me for how exhausting this was going to be. Physically exhausting. I'd come home and my wife would say, "What'd you do today?" And I couldn't tell her. A, because some things I couldn't tell her. B, because I had no energy left. It's hard work, even if it's all about the neck. And I wasn't ready for that. Now that's number 7.
No, that's fine. I mean, one of the things I was told early on was that an hour in the pulpit at the altar up front is equivalent to an 8-hour shift in any job. So expect to be tired, because what you are required to do in leading people, to put yourself out there, particularly if you are an introverted personality type. But when you think about the degree of preparation that goes into sermon and liturgical leadership, even if you don't do everything, to look on that hour as a full day But then they crash about 3 o'clock. And I was always done by 1 o'clock. Always. Still happens.
I never took naps until I got this job.
One thing I found.
We have 2 of those services.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I found helpful is to watch clips of not just preaching, but maybe people speaking, different types of oratory, or even people preaching. Watch people preaching from other faith traditions. Even if you don't maybe necessarily agree with what they're saying, it can be helpful to watch them and say, well, what makes them resonate with their congregation? What is making the congregation appear interested? So I find it helpful to watch preachers from all different types of denominations to see their strengths, see their weaknesses, and apply it to your own preaching task.
It's so true. When I was at Acadia, I took a preaching course as part of my studies. And I can't say that it was a very, I learned quite a lot from the class, and I'd rather from a very negative sort of song. Is that fair?
Beside each other.
Is that fair?
And ditch together.
Yes, there you go. So, the congregation was very good about going along this educational journey with me. So I would share with them what I was reading in the books I was reading from all different classes, and they loved it because they were being stimulated too. When I got to the preaching one, the only good thing that came out of the whole thing was, it's kind of neat that you now give your sermon a title, because we can come in and we're like, oh, I wonder where she's going to go with that. It kind of twigs an imaginative response before the sermon ever happens. But they said, okay, you can throw out that sermon method. They literally, it was not part of our culture. It wasn't the way that we talk. It's not the way that we tell story. It's not the propositional kind of truths put up in a row. So that was really good for all of us as hearers and speakers to learn about ourselves. That, you know what, this isn't us and we're not going to do it anymore. Nice to try, but I can go to the
Thanks for talking about it.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Susan?
I have a question. I want to ask a question about pushing boundaries. So I wonder if you might think about a time or an event where you were preaching and you felt that you needed to push the boundaries or push the congregation in some way, whether it's because it's a topical thing or you needed to rattle some trees to make change. And I wonder if you might just tell us what you learned from that experience, either positive or if you went too far and had to be damage control. So pushing the boundaries, the time when you went there.
I have a quick example. My first parish, farm country, seed potato growers, millions of dollars tied up in agriculture. There were certain workers who would work on harvesters who were really good workers. Most of them were women and they were well paid. Some farmers would come around and offer more money to said workers because they were such great pickers and have them come and work for them. So the two farmers would show up to church on Sunday morning, sit in the same church, one having stolen the other's worker. So you get the story of whichever vineyard story you want to go to. And it was affecting church council. It was affecting the politics of the church. It was affecting families down the road. People not talking to each other. If I said one thing and one family agreed with me, the other family would not. It was messy. So once we're going along through, and I said, or it might be stealing farm workers from your neighbors down the road. That's not what happened. And it stopped in a sense that I didn't hear of it happening again. No one confronted me, but I embarrassed them because I called the truth that day. It might have gone badly. That day it didn't. That's one of mine.
I jealously and futilely separate certain elements of my life. I like to do a lot of theater work, and that has been doing stuff without, the script, etc. But I've always said, well, that's mine, and to take that into preaching then. When I was here at First Baptist Halifax, the tradition of the church calendar was that Good Friday sermon always fell to the associate. I don't know if that's still the case, but at least that's what I was. That's what I settled with. And so for the first couple of years, Good Friday would come along in the Holy Week, and I would preach the sermon as standard. And then, for me personally, Good Friday had a meaning that I didn't feel like it was effectively communicating. So without saying anything to anybody except the organist, and the choir knew that they would be singing in certain spots, on a particular Good Friday, when it came time for Tim to stand up and to give the Good Friday sermon that people were getting used to, I stood up instead, and they thought maybe at first I was going to do striptease, but I took off my robe, I took off my hood, took off the collar, and I was in just basically neutral blacks. I went into the congregation, and I delivered a drama piece on symbols of the cross, etc. Went back, sat down, choir did the piece. I then came up with a second. It was a 3-point sermon, but just delivered in a different way. Accessing, kind of taking the risk on my part, like in some senses, because I was accessing right side activity rather than the left side that I had become very dependent upon in doing the sermon. And a couple of things were noted at the end. First of all, it was quite appreciated. People were wanting my written text on that, which I hadn't seen. I didn't know that they exist. Secondly, somebody else noted, all that perspiring that you do when you preach, you didn't perspire at all. And it wasn't the removal of robes. It was there was something that got accessed in that place. I don't do that a lot, and I don't believe that for me it is effective if I do that all the time. But what was revealed to me was another tool or avenue of preaching that was available that could communicate in a certain sense on that particular day at least, and there are others too, a different type of preaching event than what I had grown used to and comfortable with.
I remember on one occasion, I was doing a sermon on one of the feeding stories, feeding 5,000. And I offered an interpretation that I heard where it wasn't Jesus miraculously multiplying the loaves and fishes from the boy's lunch. When the boy brought out his lunch and Jesus blessed it and it was passed out, people were humbled by the boy's simple offering, and they took out their food that they probably would have had on some food anyway. And when everyone shared, everyone was fed. And I thought that was, in some cases, more of a miracle, people sharing their resources than the actual more conservative interpretation of that story. And I was questioned on it by a couple of people. They thought I was perhaps explaining away miracles of Christ. So that was a good learning experience for both me and hopefully for those people in our congregation. I do believe, though, as preachers, we must be careful not to scandalize the faithful in our church. And sometimes we can do that when we unleash ideas without giving careful thought as to how we're unleashing them. Maybe ideas that might be worked better through a Bible study or a small group. So I do believe that at the same time, pushing boundaries is a useful thing, but at the same time, I really personally, as preachers, it's not our job to scandalize the faithful.
I think it depends on the community to which you're serving, because I think between the two places I have served, the one I am in now, I could preach the opposite to what it is that I believe, or present opinions opposite my own. And the congregation welcomes that because they so many boundaries for him that he didn't even hear the message because he couldn't enter into it. And so I think it depends. You have to, it's easier to preach in a place where you've been because you know the people and you kind of built than going into a place and doing a one-off sermon because you can play. I've done a Rick Mercer rant before, and just of things going on in the parish that were absolutely pissing me off, quite honestly. And everybody listened because everybody knew that those were the exact words they'd said.
Yeah.
And I didn't get any back there afterwards. They're just like, "Thank you, Pastor." But they talked about the men of the coffin, right? So
Yeah, you're never going to run out of opportunities to push boundaries, either preaching or through other forms of leadership. I have a musical background, and so the first boundary I pushed was the sanctity of the organist's domain in one of my congregations, and it was bitter and ugly, and it had all kinds of other things attached to it, and it was universally my fault. We had to convene a special congregational meeting and bring in arbitrators, and it still went south. That's the one kind of boundary that I was not intentionally pushing. In fact, I did everything I could to bring it back in. The lesson there is, once you've touched the balloon with something sharp, you can't put it back together. And on the other hand, I don't think there's been a Sunday in the last 6 years that I haven't pushed somebody's buttons, because I serve rural congregations with a great history and a great sense of their history, but they're challenged to find a vision for the future, and that's my job. So Sunday after Sunday, I stand up and say, "What's this for, and why do you want to do it? You tell me why it's important." I don't point fingers, but everybody knows the stories, right? Because it's a small place. So that's, without being disrespectful of the legacy of faith, I can't not say, okay, if this hasn't changed you, then we shouldn't be doing it. So every day, every week is my answer.
I'm curious to know if each of you would say what's the length of your average sermon.
15 to 17 minutes.
Well, in my chapel now it's about 7 to 10 minutes, but in a typical Sunday sermon, 20 to 25 minutes.
well,
Okay.
my grandmother brought a clock before I was born in my home parish. From the front, you look through the glass doors into the day, into the narthex, and there's a clock at preaching level when you're standing in the pulpit, because they had a pastor who went on.
Yeah.
And she put the clock there. She walked into church that Sunday morning and she said, "That clock, 10 minutes. If you can't say what you want to say in 10 minutes, not worth saying." So 12.
Yeah, 15 or so minutes. Oddly, my sermons used to contain, I used to be a word count freak. I used to shoot for a certain number of words in a sermon. And my sermons have gotten shorter in actual length on the paper. Not many are more than 1,000 words now. But I can't bring it in under 15 minutes. I'm a charter member of the Slow Talker Society.
Thank you.
I think it was Tim that one of your points, lessons, one of your 4 things, was regarding not judging yourself and comparing yourself to other preachers. And so I wonder, when you, all 4 of you, are off on a given Sunday, do you go to worship? And if so, how do you experience worship as an individual, not as a group?
So for 2 years, I took leave to enter the doctoral program at Acadia, and I decided for at least the first year when I was attending church, not to sing the hymns and not to say anything in the response of my wife was but to listen. And I also have the luxury that, although I conduct services in the chapel, I'm a member of Wolfville Baptist Church. My services on Sundays take place in the evening at 7 o'clock, so I go on a regular basis to listen. And I do glean a lot of lessons from the different styles of preaching, but it's for me, it's the struggle, again, not to go, oh, I can't preach another sermon because, wow, and to be discouraged in that. So that's what I do.
I'm afraid I had the opposite reaction quite a while ago. And to answer the question truthfully, not always do I go to worship on Sunday. There has to be something within easy distance for me to get to. For a long time, one of the requirements was I wouldn't go to a place where I was also the interim moderator, because I would inevitably be drawn into some business that I didn't really need. And I was interim moderator now only at 2 places. I was at 3. So that was hard. Training was hard. But I really, really struggled to sit and worship, not as a critic. I attended a funeral of a family member years ago, and he'd been a big wheel in the community and started the ambulance service and ran the funeral home and everything else in Brighton. And there were 3, count them, 3 United Church ministers deputized to conduct this funeral. And one had known him for a long time, and one was the new incumbent, and one was, I don't know where they got this other one. And about halfway through the second meditation, I took out a pen and started making notes on my bulletin. And my wife slapped my hands. "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm ensuring that this never happens to me." I was trying to recreate it on behalf of everybody who was there, and that's a real struggle.
I always enjoy, it is my experience that I don't preach on Sundays. Most of my preaching is done in the chapel services that I mentioned. So on Sundays I get to attend my home church. And I always usually enjoy it. We have a very good preacher right now. 2 preachers in the Salvation Army. If you're married, both of you are usually ordained. So a husband and wife ministry team. And they're both very, very good preachers. But knowing something of the struggles of preaching, I like to encourage them at the end of the sermon. Say one thing that I appreciated, something specific other than just that was a nice sermon. which you'll hear.
For me, when I go away, like out of the country away, I like to visit other Lutheran churches to see how it's done in other parts of the world. Here I'll go to other traditions to see what's happening. It's not the sermon that usually gets me. I can sit through a dreadful sermon. I've sat through dreadful lectures. I've sat through all kinds of parental, whatever. What I cannot tolerate, and it makes me a very bad pew sitter, is bad liturgics. Lutherans we have predominantly a very specific way that we worship, and it's kind of like Catholicism or Anglicanism. You start here in the book and you go here in the book, and it might be different tunes, but it's the same words. And there's a certain flow and grace to it. And if the leader screws up, I'm done. So I'd rather have terrible preaching and good leadership throughout the service.
I remember asking a former moderator of my church what it was like to travel across the country and attend worship in so many churches and not always be the preacher, even though he was the guest. And he said to his surprise, most of the preaching was pretty good. Most of the leadership of prayer was absolutely horrible. And I think that's what often gets me too. I can sit through a sermon that I would rate as it's technically bad, muddled, confused, and so on. But if it's preached by someone with integrity who is clearly doing a love for the people and has done their work, the issue is how they've structured it. That's fine, because I can enter the relationship. But if the liturgy is slapdash, I'm offended on behalf of God.
Yeah.
And so I find that very difficult. And I can apply that across the board. I mean, I'm very high church myself in terms of my own tradition. But whatever the liturgical tradition of the church or its denomination, again, if it's done clearly with preparation, intent, integrity, and an approach to the service as a whole, because the whole service preaches, then I'm happy, then I'm comfortable. And the technical quality of the sermon is far way down the list. And occasionally, I do know some preachers who will ask me, and I'll say, well, here's what you might have done with that. Here's what I might have done with that. I appreciate what you did with that. Tell me more about that. That's the sort of conversation that I can have. But I don't always go to church on Sunday, but particularly if I've been to Chaplain 4 times here.
There's a limit, is there?
Sometimes walking my dog on a sunny Sunday morning is a deeply spiritual experience. And particularly at kickoff time is 11:30.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
What do you find the most rewarding part of preaching?
We've already established that I'm in it for the money.
I had to stop and think for a second because it sounds very unhumble. I like preaching. I love preaching. It's a place where I get to say out loud where it is that I am, and with my own theology, with the theology of the community, creating vision and imagination. I mean, what is not to love about it? And if you speak too much about it, it's like you could get a big head over it, right? And I think I do it pretty well. That it's one of my gifts. So, and it's an honor, really, to recreate the gospel, the story, to tell it in your own words, to bring it alive. There's no better job in the world.
I get to argue with Paul.
Yeah, that's cool too.
Right? I mean, you get to stand in public and say, Paul, really? What were you thinking? And you get to follow that up with, with instant rebuttal. And maybe you get some response to a sermon like that. But in the end, the reward is that somewhere in the congregation you saw somebody go, right? Just you've taken a burden off of them because they thought it too, right? Anybody that tells you that their faith was formed when they were 10 and they learned the catechism and they joined the church and did all that, and that's it, they're lying. They're lying. Because you can see it when you say something that's so ridiculous that it can't be unique to you. And they go, it's subtle, but yeah, you're taking it with you, and that's the gift. You're right, there's no better place to be.
As someone that's somewhat introverted, preaching gives me the chance to play an extrovert. Like when I came to chapel today, and we don't have this tradition in our church, but when you were doing the passing of peace, part of me was like, in some ways we're more in some ways we're more informal, a handshake and whatever. But yeah, I do enjoy the feeling that you're partaking in the gospel, you're partaking in God's work. And it's hard to nail down for me, but it's very...
Similar to Rob, but with a couple of differences. Myers-Briggs, 2 times that I've taken, has scored me 50-50 split between intro and extra. And I get in touch with the extrovert aspects of my personality within theater, or doing some shows and things like that. Drawing away from that, I don't have a huge cadre of friends that I'm immediately going to go in the thriving metropolis of Wolfville or anything like that. A lot of times I'll be at home, maybe play a game of hand or something like that, but sometimes she'll say, hey, what do you want to do? And I'll say, I'm doing it. So in that split, it's a little bit different though. When I get to the preaching event, to be sure, there are some similarities to the communication tools that I have to employ that I might do if I'm playing a character on stage or doing something else. But there is also revealed to me a vast difference in the communication. What is rewarding and similar from both, as that extrovert side is being explored and nurtured and fed, is, I don't have a clear definition of it, the exchange of the energy between listener and speaker, and I don't think it's all about just my ego, oh, everyone's listening to Tim, how great is that? But it's that ongoing communication effort which feeds that side of my personality. And I can only, I guess at the end of the day, then say, okay, well, my calling to ministry is incorporating that part of what makes me me, and I will honor that and do the very best that I can, acknowledging the reality of the differences too. The sermon is not something that at the end of the day I would feel comfortable if everybody went like that. Although, in some traditions that's perfectly acceptable. But I strive hard not to have everybody sitting in the congregation going. So, that exchange and exploration, so for me that's something.
Well, thank you so much.